All right, we are in chapter 29 of 1 Samuel, and we're going to get through this tonight and on into 2 Samuel. So remember in where we're at, David is he's left Israel or left the tribal lands, and he's kind of out doing his own thing. And he's actually living in the land of the Philistines right now, and the Philistines are preparing for war, and David, he goes along. But, they're going over to fight some of the Israeli folks, so the elders refuse, believing that he would turn against them, so the Philistine king tells him and his men to go back home. So chapter 29, verse 1, 1 Samuel. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He's already been with me for over a year, and from that day he left Saul until now, I found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, "Send the man back that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you've been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until now, I've found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back, go in peace, do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king?" Okay, so David acts surprised. I kind of think he might have been a tad relieved, but the point of the story, while it's implied and you got to dig there, God intervened, okay? God prevented the Philistine rulers from allowing David to go to battle against Israel. If he had, things probably would have worked out differently for David's future and for Israel. The Philistines here are ungodly, and David was rejected by the ungodly. When Saul was a godly man, he accepted David. When Saul became ungodly, he rejected David. Ungodly people reject what is godly. God uses the rejection of the ungodly to David's best use. Let's read and find out how. Achish answered, "I know that you've been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, he must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. All right, the Philistine leaders, I think, were the angels in this case, as we will see. So while David has been off to fight with the Philistines, the Amalekites took advantage of the absence of David's army, and they attacked the village. And they take all of the families of the Hebrews alive, and they're going to sell them as slaves in Egypt. So chapter 30, verse 1. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam and Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit, because of his sons and daughters, but David found strength in the Lord his God. So David suffers a crisis of leadership. And where did he find strength? It's right there in the last verse. He found strength in the Lord his God. I think part of that strength may have come from the realization of how God had just worked in his life. Had the Philistines not rejected David and his men, they would never have been back in time to pursue their families. And so God used the ungodly for good. Verse 7. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod, meaning the priest. Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. So this priest, symbolized by the ephod, is talking for God. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor ravine, where some stayed behind. For 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine, but David and 400 men continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, to whom do you belong, and where do you come from? He said, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. David asked him, can you lead me down to this raiding party? He answered, swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I'll take you down to them. He led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder, or anything else they had taken. David brought back everything. He took all of his flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, this is David's plunder. So not too long ago, they wanted to stone David, and now that David was successful, they're praising him again. But notice what's interesting is here these Amalekites come in, and they take all the boys and girls and the women. Now, what do you think the obvious thing to do would have been? Would have been to go after them, right? But David asked God first. Now, see, the lesson is sometimes we think we know what the obvious answer is. And perhaps 9 out of 10 times we're right, but we still should go to God first. We still should go to God first. Knowing that God is behind his action, David has the courage to continue even when 1/3 of his men end up saying, man, we can't go, we're exhausted. So he was able, because he knew God said, it's okay, go for it. He's got courage. Not only does he succeed, he gains flocks from the enemy, and he makes good use of the plunder. Let's read on verse 21. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Besor ravine. They came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them, but all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. David replied, no, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. David made this a statute of ordinance for Israel from that day to this. Notice that David says what the Lord has given us. He doesn't say, hey, you know what, we went out and fought this and we were successful and but we're going to share. He says, no, this is what the Lord has given us. So think about that with your money. Think about that with your possessions. Think about that with your resources. The Lord has given it to you. That's the way we need to consider. Verse 26, when David arrived at Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, here is a present for you from the plunder. See, Saul's not dead yet. Well, actually he is. We just haven't read that yet. But David doesn't know it, okay? So here he is out doing the work of a king, getting plunder from Israel's enemies, and sending it back to some of the folks in Judah. Amazing. When David arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, here's a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. He sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir, and to those in Aor, Simpmoth, and all those other places. Okay, so that's what David does. So, the point of the story is David was looking after his people back home, even when he was in exile. And it also served another purpose. He's acting like a king. This is what kings did. They went out and fought battles and sent the spoils back home to the people so that Israel would be stronger as a nation. All right, chapter 31. Remember last week we read about that witch, who Saul went to a witch and tried to get some information. And the witch said that, you're going to fall to the Philistines. Well, it takes place in timelines. This is taking place while David is out fighting the Amalekites. Verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinab, and Malchishua. Their fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. So Saul was more fearful of what might happen at the hands of the Philistines than he was of death. Now, in that time in Israel's history, there was no strong feelings about suicide, in part because there was no established belief in heaven or hell. All the people believed that they would go to the same place, this dim, misty place called Sheol. And others say, well, he didn't really commit suicide because death was going to happen. He was dying. He just sped up the process. Is this a cause for assisted suicide? Well, the Old Testament has 4 cases of suicide. And for the ancient Jew, suicide wasn't always frowned upon. It was an honorable way out of certain death. And even though we don't have that in the Bible, we know from other writings that maybe it wouldn't. Well, I talked about that when they were traveling in the wilderness, when they were semi-nomads in the wilderness. It was common practice for semi-nomads that when the elderly were slowing people down, they would just prop them up at an oasis, give them a thing of water and say, see ya, okay? And that was sort of like suicide. They left them there to die, and some of the elderly would indeed kill themselves. We can't really read too much into these ancient depictions about suicide and not, and again, because the theology is primitive. There is no reward or punishment. There's no heaven or hell. Well, they don't have a concept of it as yet. That had not been revealed to them. So, verse 7. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled, and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall at Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall at Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. All right, that's 1 Samuel. Any questions about those final chapters before we jump into 2 Samuel, the sequel? All right. So here in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, we have an account of Saul's death, and it's a little different than the one we just had in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. Different sources. You got 4 gospels, different way of telling the story. So anyway, verse 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. Remember, that's a sign of mourning. When he came to David, he fell on the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." He said, "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul, leaning on his spear, with the chariots and riders almost upon him. And when he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand over and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." And then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. Remember, that's a sign of mourning. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of an alien," or it might say sojourner, which is really what it says in the Hebrew. "So I am a sojourner, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down and he died, for David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" All right. So just a couple of minutes ago, we read about the Amalekites stole David and his men's family. David defeated them, brought his families back, and those were Amalekites. And so now we have an Amalekite in this story. Why would Amalekite be coming up to David? And why was this Amalekite fighting, seemingly fighting, with the Jews? What's going on? Well, the key is in verse 13, where he says, "I am a sojourner." I am a sojourner. And that's what it says in the Hebrew. And the Hebrew word sojourner was a technical term, we might say for somebody with a green card, to put it into, in our language. This was somebody of foreign birth who was granted limited citizenship within Israel. They were expected to conform religiously. They were protected. They were offered work, but they did not have all of the rights that the Israelites had. So David obviously believed that no one had the right to take someone's life. So what does he do? He takes the guy's life. Okay, yeah. Well, when I say take a guy's life, he doesn't believe that someone has the right to take a life just to end it sooner, So David ended his life. But yeah, exactly. That's where I'm going. The point to the Israelites that no one had the right to end the life of God's anointed except God. Also, had the Amalekite lived, see, here's something political we don't really think about. Had the Amalekite lived and David rewarded him for bringing David Saul's crown, it would have appeared to many that David had the Amalekite kill Saul so David could assume the throne. So there was a political reason why he had him killed too. All right, verse 17. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan and ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. What book is that? That's not in the Bible, of course not. The book of Jashar was a book of poems and songs, which poems and songs were the same for them. But the book no longer exists, but we do have other non-biblical writings that reference it and even have bits and pieces from it like we have here. So we know it was a real book. And there is that poem, verses 19 through 27. We're not going to read it. It's just there for you to read tonight if you can't sleep. No, it's really nice, pretty poetry. All right, so chapter 2. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord. Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah, he asked. The Lord said, go up. David asked, where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah, because remember he had been living in the Philistine area. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. When David was told that it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead to say to them, the Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and be brave, for Saul, your master, is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. So, David, who had been anointed the next king many years ago, perhaps as many as 15 years ago, doesn't just ride up into Israel and take over. He doesn't even ride up and immediately make his presence known. He prays about it and goes where the Lord tells him to go. David was the Lord's anointed. He knew it, but he also believed in God's timing. And God's timing is often different than our timing, and we need to do what David did, and that is to stay in contact with God through prayer to better able to know God's timing. You and I also have something in addition to prayer. We, of course, have the presence of the Holy Spirit, and we have the Word of God in the Scripture. So, David had been, remember, all this time he was in exile. He was sending goods back, flocks back to the people from these raids. So he's sort of a folk hero. In verses 6 through 7, David showed some great statesmanship. He compliments those men's bravery for going after the body of Saul. He calls for them to remain brave and strong. In essence, he was saying, look, I know I can count on you when I need you. And he would need them very soon because the followers of Saul are going to reject David's authority. Verse 8, meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asher, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. All right, so back in 1 Samuel chapter 14, we were told that Abner, this guy here, was Saul's cousin. So this is a cousin of Saul. He sets up Saul's son as a king, essentially declaring war against David. as far as earthly kingships were set up, David lost any claim to being a king earthwise. I know God anointed him, but on earthly traditions, he lost any claim to being the next king when Saul took his daughter Michal back from David. Remember that, because David's going to do something about that. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. So you get the idea that David just doesn't ride in the town and become king over all of the lands of the Jewish people. The house of Judah, however, followed David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So, David knows that he's been anointed king over all of the tribal lands, but he doesn't go to battle to take them over. One gift that David did have was patience. Verse 12. Well, actually there, verse 11, when it says the length of time David was king in Hebron, that's just in Hebron when that was the capital. He was king for much longer. Verse 12. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into the opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazarim, and that means field of daggers. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's men. So obviously, verse 17, that last verse, leads us to believe that a larger battle broke out following the hand-to-hand combat between the two groups of 12. Verse 18. The three sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was a fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right or to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. So Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot. And every man stopped when he came to that place where Asahel had fallen and died. So, why was David reluctant to kill this guy, Asahel? Well, Asahel was the son of Zeruiah. And who was that? A sister of David. This is David's nephew. He knew that killing him would lead to him being marked for death by David. Verse 24. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammon near Giah on the way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers?" Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued the pursuit of their brothers until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight anymore. Well, don't think the brothers are going to let this go. Verse 29. All that night, Abner and his men marched through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, continued through the whole Bithron, and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab returned from pursuing Abner and assembled all his men. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing. But David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron by daybreak. So David's troops have a pretty rousing victory, but remember, Saul's troops had suffered just recently, just days before, great defeat by the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. When we read 2 Samuel, we kind of get the idea that the Jews spent as much time fighting amongst themselves as they did all those other people they were supposed to conquer. And if you had read carefully, up to this point, they'd been fighting amongst themselves. In fact, up to this point, we've been seeing references, and some of you have asked, because it talks about Judah and Israel. But I thought they were united. They have not been united yet. They will be united, but really it's for a brief period of time. All right, chapter 3. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. That might have been 40 years, but it wasn't. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. All right, spiritual application here that we shouldn't miss. David had the Spirit of God upon him, while the house of Saul did not. And so this battle can be an analogy of a spiritual battle, which often, like the Civil War here that we're reading about, lasts a long time. The battle lasts even longer when we try to make peace with what is opposed to the Spirit of God. That's what happens with these folks from David's camp. They're trying to make peace with people who don't have the Spirit of God. Now, if it's a spiritual battle, you can't make peace with your demons. Okay? If you're having a spiritual battle with whatever sin it is, you can't make peace with it and everything be fine. And this is what we got going on. All right, verse 2. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Ammon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonai, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, son of David's wife, Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. Wow, where'd all these wives come from? Now he's got 6. He's got one son from each. We know he had some daughters. They're not mentioned here. But kings, because they wanted to be kings like all the other people, had multiple wives for political reasons. If you had a wife from this little kingdom over here, chances are that little kingdom and you were allies. You weren't going to go to war. If you had a wife from a kingdom over here, and remember, these kingdoms are small, but they're still, significant for that day and time. But if you had a wife from a kingdom over there, chances are you aren't going to go to war with them either. But what had God said to the people? Well, I'll tell you what he said. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. God, or Moses speaking for God, says, "Your king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray." And we know that one of David's weaknesses was indeed women. Verse 6. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine, so he's got a concubine. He's got concubines in addition to his wives. Saul had a concubine. Oh, this is a great story. Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Ai, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" You know what Abner just did? Just made himself king. You take the king's wife or concubine, you make yourself king. That's what he just did. It's a bold political move. Ishbosheth, he really was never mentioned until Saul died, leading many believe that maybe he was an illegitimate child. Maybe he was a child of a concubine, or perhaps just ineffective. Anyway, it appears that Ishbosheth was a weak person, weak leader, and Abner, we're just told, was strengthening his position. Yeah, he strengthened his position. He took Saul's concubine, and made her his. So Abner is being accused of treason, and because he just proclaimed himself king. Verse 8. Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth said, and he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Ishbosheth did not dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. All right, so we're never told if this accusation from Ishbosheth is true. Abner doesn't deny it, but he decides to go to the defect. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Verse 12. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, "Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." "Good," said David. "I'll make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins." All right. Did David need another wife? So why does he want Michal back? It's going to have political reasons. Yeah, she's the daughter of the dead king. If that becomes his wife, that's another claim to the throne. All right. Some people say, but he really loved Michal. As we read the chapters that follow, they didn't really have a loving relationship, okay? So, nothing is ever said about how Michal feels about all this. She's already been married to another. It's been years. She's probably not too happy. Ancient rabbis would say, but her relationship with her new husband was never consummated. No, this is all political. It's all political. But there's a spiritual lesson here. Let's dig into it. David was looking for an earthly claim, even though God had already anointed him. He didn't need an earthly claim. He had God's claim. All right? You and I have God-given authority too. But sometimes we'd rather seek earthly authority. All right, verse 15. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. And Abner said to him, "Go back home." So he went back. Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it. For the Lord promised David, by my servant David, I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." Abner also spoke with the Benjamites in person. Then he went to Hebron and to tell David everything that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a compact with you, and that you may rule over all of your heart's desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. All right, so we still are seeing something of the great patience of David. It wasn't David who went to the elders of Israel to try to convince them that he was the rightful king. It was Abner. David knew that for him to rule with any success, he would have to be sought by the people to be their king. He couldn't just come in and say, "I'm your king," and everybody say, "Yeah, great, long live the king." We can't really say at this point what Abner's motivation was, because he had risen so high in Saul's house. Perhaps he saw the writing on the wall, or perhaps he truly had a change of heart. David continues to show his true character by having a feast prepared for Abner, but in the midst of peace talk, someone with a hot head always seems to mess things up. Let's read the drama, verse 22. Just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner, son of Ner, had come to the king and that the king had sent him away and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why'd you let him go? Now he's gone. You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you're doing." Joab left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the wall of Sirah. But David didn't know it. Now, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway as though to speak with him privately, and there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Later, when David heard about this, he said, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon all of his father's house. May Joab's house never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food." Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle at Gibeon. All right, so Hebron was a city of refuge. It had been established by the book of Numbers, and so a city of refuge was a place that if you got into a squabble and somebody was killed, you know, the family would come and kill you, so you ran to a city of refuge and you could stay there until the trial sorted things out. Well, Joab kills Abner at the gate of this city of refuge, and it was a bold move, a move that could have destroyed the alliance between the kingdoms. David would have to act accordingly, politically, or this union would be lost. And so the following verses will show that David takes every possible precaution to disassociate himself from the traitors. Verse 31. Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, "Tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, walk in mourning in front of Abner." King David himself walked behind the bier. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. All the people also wept also. The king sang this lament for Abner. "Should Abner have died as a lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before wicked men." And all the people wept over him. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets." All the people took note and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. Then the king said to his men, "Do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." All right, so in verse 36, we're told that the people saw David's reaction, and they approved. However, he doesn't have Joab killed. He had the Amalekite killed, who killed Saul, but he doesn't here, maybe because Joab was kin, or maybe he just knew that he was at a it was a tipping point. It was a very shaky moment here in their history, and David was trying to balance things. So that's where we will end for tonight, and we will pick up here next Sunday evening. So with Mephibosheth. That's one of my favorite names in all the Bible, Mephibosheth. All right, questions? Yeah, these Jews do a lot of fighting amongst themselves. I mean, a lot. Let's pray. Gracious God, it seems that your people continue to fight today. We've always found things to divide ourselves. And I pray, Lord, that the Spirit, your Spirit, would be cause for us to be united, would cause for us to not fight. That no matter what our denomination, no matter what our name, that we would always be willing to work side by side with other Christians to minister to the needs of one another. Thank you for these ancient stories, Lord, and what they teach us yet today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for coming, folks. Thanks.